tātou, ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa. Welcome to Beyond the Bubble, a series of moderated conversations about topics that can cause division in our communities. The purpose of these conversations is to create communication across gaps. And our topic today is euthanasia, or assisted dying. And we're most fortunate today to have three participants in our panel, and I'd like to welcome Wendi Wicks, the convener of Not Dead Yet Aotearoa, a network of disabled people opposed to euthanasia and assisted dying legislation. Maryan Street, former Labour Cabinet Minister and Labour Party President, a strong proponent of the current end-of-life choice bill. And Dion Howard, a registered nurse with over 20 years' experience in youth development and adolescent mental health, who works with young people at high risk of suicide. Ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Maryan, I'd like to start with you. You've been deeply involved in assisted dying legislation in some form or another for several years. I'd like to ask you where you think the common ground exists.
Tēnā koe, Mamari. Mihi nui ki a koe. The common ground is not hard to find, actually. If I say three words, one is autonomy, one is dignity, and one is compassion. And it doesn't matter whether you say them in English or Māori. People understand aroha. They understand compassion. And they all understand whether they are people with disabilities, people with terminal illnesses, people at very vulnerable moments in their lives. They understand the importance of autonomy and independence as far as humanly possible. So on those three issues, autonomy, dignity, which is, after all, a fundamental human right, and compassion, I think there is probably a great deal of common ground with my co-debaters here.
Wendi, picking up on that, do you think that there is common ground here?
I think that there is common ground indeed. Perhaps we might have slightly different ways of tracking it, but I would take a slightly complementary way of rephrasing that to say that there, I think, is a lot of commonality of what we want to achieve. What I think the difference is in how it's achieved.
Dion, autonomy seems to be perhaps the starting point that Maryan identified. What was your response to that?
No, I think they're very good points. I think no one would argue with, wanting those values. I think the debate is characterised by a society that is predominantly quite individualistic. So autonomy is very important, and it should be balanced with the responsibilities we have to one another. My feeling is we don't have as much common ground as Maryan, you would suggest, because I think that the language of the debate and the elements of the debate, that the proponents of the changes have been very successful at capturing, at framing that debate. And I think the common ground that we do have is it's a very natural and normal human response to want to avoid unnecessary suffering. Yet we cannot avoid that entirely in life. Suffering does occur and will occur.
I think the language point is very important. I'm the president of the End-of-Life Choice Society. We changed our name. It used to be the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. And so many people object to the language of euthanasia because it is something we associate with elderly and sick animals. It has got connotations to it that are nothing to do with choice. They're nothing to do with that point of terminal illness when the suffering has become intolerable for the person, not for their doctor or for their family, but for the person themselves. So we talk about medically assisted dying, and that's as near to what we mean as we can conjure up with words.
And actually that's the point that we made before we started filming, Wendi, is that you would prefer to use the term assisted suicide.
I would, because people will call it what they will, but medically assisted dying is what we all do, and you don't need special legislation for it.
Kia ora.
Our doctor helps us in one way or another, or our nurse, or our health professional. That's why I'd probably say we would use more the term assisted suicide. But words do matter, but they don't matter so much as what actually happens on the ground.
And I'm very keen for what happens on the ground to be regulated, because the kind of picture you're drawing there, Wendi, seems to me to be dangerous in the extreme because it is unregulated. And so we have people illegally importing drugs that they know nothing about. They don't know whether they are going to be effective. They don't know what's in them. And so we have a completely unregulated environment where doctors are at risk, nurses are at risk of criminal liability, and people and their loved ones are at risk. And none of that is satisfactory if we're trying to alleviate suffering, it seems to me.
And I tend to look at the words of those people who have looked at the regulation in other jurisdictions. For instance, the words of Lord Sumption in Britain, where they've done several fairly in-depth looks at it. And he's of the opinion, and I paraphrase, that you cannot regulate properly and safely because the laws are always going to advantage one lot of people against another lot of people, and it's people like me who are on the margins who would be most at risk, and people like me are 25% of the population.
Wendi, I'd like to just pursue that point with you somewhat, because in regards to your organisation, you must have heard quite a lot of stories and anxieties from disabled communities about what this legislation potentially represents for them. And where do we draw the line between autonomy and the protection of the vulnerable? I'd like you to talk to that a little bit, if you could.
I think that, yes, I have heard a lot of voices. I've heard a lot of other voices saying, well, no, I like the idea of having a choice, or I like the idea of disabled people having choices. God knows we get precious little of it, but it's how the choice is constructed in a way that enables us, if assisted dying, if assisted suicide, if euthanasia is the only choice we've got, real choice we've got in life, then we are being sold short by that kind of thing. We need help to live our lives well with proper supports. And then you think about assisted suicide. You think about that after you have enabled somebody to live a good life.
Dion, from your perspective, working with youth, you would perhaps want to pick up on what Wendi's saying there in terms of flipping the narrative to looking to positive life choices and creating positive choices, particularly for our young people who are themselves more vulnerable.
Sure. So I think in the lead up to the most recent election, mental health became a really critical issue in the election, and I think that's very good that it did. And so we know that in New Zealand we have an issue around suicide, and particularly youth suicide. Now, I have a number of opinions about assisted dying outside of that scope, but within that scope, in my area of kind of experience and expertise, I've simply wanted to ask the question that when we shift a societal standard in a direction where electing to have assistance to die, or suicide for your phrase, but Where does that leave a population of people who are vulnerable to suicide already? Now, the Scottish Parliament rejected this legislation on that basis that it worked against anti-suicide public health goals. Also, I kind of note that the Mental Health Foundation, when 13 Reasons Why came out, their public statement about the issue is that, suicide is a complex issue with many factors that contribute towards it. Shouldn't we be asking whether this would be a factor? And really, I would ask, kind of advocates of assisted dying, whether they can be certain that it wouldn't have an effect. And I'm confident that there is no certainty. There may be some certainty in 20 years' time in a population and a sort of jurisdiction similar to New Zealand, but I'm pretty certain at the moment we cannot be certain that it wouldn't have an effect on young people who are vulnerable to the risk of suicide.
This is a really critical issue, and forgive me if my language gets a little bit pointy here. Sure. The parameters of the end-of-life choice bill, which is a narrowed-down version of the bill I had when I was in Parliament, prevent the things that you are anxious about, which are legitimate anxieties, from occurring. In other words, there are certain criteria that have to be met that I think would also meet some of your concerns, Wendi. The unfortunate thing is conflating youth suicide, about which we should all be terribly concerned, and which is an issue of real moment for New Zealand society. Conflating that with assisted dying at the end of a terminal illness, or when an irremediable condition provokes more suffering than the person can bear any longer, and that is tightly regulated, then I think there is a fundamental dishonesty in that conflation, because one is a legitimate concern that we should all share, and the other is about a choice. And when we're talking about your patients, Dion, we're talking about people with limited choices because they are so young, and so they need assistance and they need protection, for want of a better word, but they need to be walked through that moment of vulnerability in their life. In the end, suicide is lawful. Assisting a suicide is not lawful, and that remains the same in jurisdictions which have adopted legislation like this, such as the Netherlands.
I'd like to pick up on some of those points, but I think we're just going to stop for a moment right now.